He has been selected by a lot of people in the government to represent the idea that there are peaceful Muslims and that it's not the evil religion, you know, and everything, and that there's good people that want to be free also. Now, that's what I want to know. You know, two things. Why is it that we associate Islam with violence, which I have, you know, very close Muslim friends that would disagree with that and say that's why they became Muslim as Americans, because of the peace component and being libertarian. Now, my biggest question, though, is how do you get selected by the government to represent this position? You go into the Senate. You go to hearings. You're on, you know, conservative television to say this. Why you? I'm very interested in hearing how this became and where we're going, because there is this is going to be a consternation for a long time, and with the tension that we have in the Mideast right now and what's going on with Israel, with Russia, with China, Iran, which is Persian. You know, we have Iraq, Syria. Now, he came here, his family moved here in 1966 as part of refugees from Syria because of what was happening back then. So now we're going to hear from Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. Hopefully I'm saying this right. A lot of the questions here, and hopefully a lot more things are going to get answered. Dr. Jasser. You just want to take the mic? Yep, I'll take it.
Thank you, Ernie.
I apologize. Somebody has their dome light on. Silver Hyundai IBC Tucson. License BWP 6399. You got dome light on your battery. Silver Hyundai.
Thank you, Ernie, and I want to thank Mark for his trust and having me be here, and the rest of the organizers, Mike, and all of you in preparations for this meeting and get-together. There's really nothing more dear to my heart than freedom, and I would jump at the opportunity to talk at a Freedom Summit. I know many of you. I want to thank Dr. Fisher for his support over the years, and many others of you that are here and might be watching this. Yeah, this is quite a topic to try to talk to you about over the next 60 minutes that we have together. I'm going to try to spend maybe 3/4 of an hour and then take 15 minutes of your questions. So, you know, I like to put things in context. I think that the context of where we are, it's easy to compartmentalize the Muslim question, if you will, or Islam, and just deal with what's up to our shores and look at the Muslim community as a monolith. We are not. What I want to do is really the context that I want to put my time with you today in is, as Ralph Waldo Emerson said, there are always two parties, the party of the past and the party of the future, the establishment and the movement. And I really thought that is really apropos to today, because a lot of people are talking about President Trump's ascendancy, as you know, and as he talked about in his campaign, as being outside the establishment. And I think from the ethnocentricity of American politics, we look at where we are, and you can diagnose and figure out how President Trump came to win the nomination and then the presidency. But the bottom line is he did so as an outsider, as somebody who wasn't part of the political elite. And as Ernie introduced me, I'm scratching my head listening to him talk to us and saying that I'm part of one of the Muslims selected by government. The reality is I guess that probably the reality that some of you may see, especially within some of the conservative movement or libertarians. But the reality is our organization is on the periphery. The folks leading Muslim representation, the folks who have budgets in the tens and hundreds of millions of dollars that are Muslim organizations in America, are Islamists. They're theocrats. They are either supported by Qatar, by Turkey, or by their antagonists, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and others. So the reformers, while I think many in the conservative movement get it and have not given the Islamists much of a platform, that's not to say they haven't. I mean, if you look at the folks funding a lot of the presidential libraries, be it the Bush Library, the Reagan Library, or others, it includes a lot of petro-Islamic dollars. So I am fighting the Islamists both from the far left, which I call the red-green axis, and also within the conservative movement. So we are often in quite a lonely endeavor as reformists. And what I want to do is lay out for you, and I understand the fact that if you see a vision, if you see a future for America that doesn't include us sending our sons and daughters to wars indefinitely, to a whack-a-mole program that has continued to be ineffective wherever it is across the planet. You know, I served in the military, and I understand the price that we pay, and it's really ineffective. And I can talk to you about some of the countries that we have had missions in and what some of the goals might be or should not have been. But at the end of the day, I think it's all about ideas. They should be able to fight their own wars, and they can't win wars unless there's a goal. And if you look at our programs, the reason we are losing is because we've been on defense. So if there's one thing you take away from my time with you today is our mission at the American Islamic Forum. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our organization. But our mission is that we shift the American mindset from being on defense when it comes to the Islamists and the anti-American, anti-liberty, anti-freedom movement across the planet, to us being on offense. We have, and what being on offense, what? Not against them. There's too many things, as Rick just laid out over history, that to fight. But 70% of the world is living under some form of tyranny right now. And why don't we have an offense for freedom? The Qataris, a little island the size of Rhode Island, is spending billions of dollars on Al Jazeera and other media outlets that are spreading ideas that are not only anti-American, anti-Western, but they are anti-freedom. We are spending virtually nothing when it comes to messaging within the Muslim world, and the money that we are spending regarding messaging is actually apologetics, that America is not that bad, it's not a conspiracy theory, we sell blue jeans and music and rock and roll and other things, we're not out there to hurt you, it's all apologetics. It's not actually free speech, as you saw about Asiya Bibi. Asiya Bibi, who was one of, by the way, that's one person. There are thousands of young women, of men in jail, tortured for free speech issues in Pakistan and Afghanistan and across the Muslim world. You hear one or two cases that then become icons, but at the end of the day, there are thousands of those cases. She couldn't find a country to get asylum in. It took her months until I think Canada finally did so. The UK refused to. Why? They were worried about riots from Muslims within their populations that would happen if she had come in. And the picture actually he showed you with the sign was in London. So at the end of the day, culture, as Peter Drucker said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So we can sit down and talk about the dynamics of Hayek and the dynamics of Jeffersonian democracy and how the Muslim world will never transform itself through tyranny into Jeffersonian democracy. But at the end of the day, where are we in the cultural war? I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the opportunities we had to put forth ideas on platforms that we missed. And it would have been low investment with high yield, and unfortunately we've been missing that. You see, on the one hand, a huge Hollywood media industry that responds to shootings within our population, and all of a sudden you have every celebrity from the Grammys to Oscars, whatever it is, talking about the Second Amendment and taking away our rights to own guns, etc. And then you have Manchester concert with Ariana Grande, who lost 40 people that were attending her concert, leave because ISIS decided to attack folks not inside the concert because they couldn't get in, but attack them as they were egressing from the auditorium, and then did another attack a few hours later. And yet her entire comments posted online and afterwards mentioned guns, but mentioned basically living peacefully together, nothing about the ideology, nothing about freedom, nothing about what we're fighting. So if you don't see an imbalance there, and I call it a bigotry of low expectations, which is, oh, when we're dealing with Muslims, let's not hold them to the same standards that we do everybody else. Let's not hold them to the same type of scrutiny. I think ultimately the question is when you look at the jihadists, what drives them, it's what they would die for. The jihadists would die for an Islamic State. They want to die for the implementation of Sharia or Islamic law, Islamic jurisprudence in their society. The flag of ISIS can be replaced with Saddam Hussein's flag, by the way, had Quranic script on it, even though he was a secular militant dictator. But yet, when he wanted to get his people together, he rallied them around Quranic scripture. Same thing with Saudi Arabia, which is technically not a theocracy, but yet the royal family imposes one of the most strident theocracies on the planet. So the bottom line is, for some of them, religion is a tool. For others, it is actually the ends, which is a theocratic state. And yet, when we talk about Islam and Muslims in America, it's simply a checkbox on diversity. And I served in the military, and I want to just give you a little bit of my background because I think it's very relevant into what the battle is I grew up in a small town in Wisconsin, learned my faith in a small mosque that had 7-8 families near Green Bay, Wisconsin, and Neenah, Wisconsin, and basically did not understand that there was any political dimension to my faith. I memorized scripture and the Quran and learned it from an Indian family, Iraqi family, and some Syrian communities. My family's from Syria, and basically had a personal relationship with God. Then I went to the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and began to have contact with the Muslim Student Association and quickly began to realize that there were large political movements based in Islam that I had no idea had anything to do with our faith. That's a small mosque that I just visited a few years ago back that my family helped build. It's still very small. It's very small because the families there refuse to take any money from the Saudis or from any other petro-Islamic tyrannies. You'll find most of the very large mosques. Right now, the largest mosque in the United States was just finished in Baltimore a few years ago. It's a $20 million mosque. It's basically built by the Turkish government. And if you listen to Erdogan's verbiage, his ideology is about spreading Islamism and spreading the minarets, which he perceives as his swords of Islam, across the planet and especially into Europe and the West. And it's even called, the mosque in Baltimore is called the Diyanet Center. Diyanet is evangelical Islam for the Turkish community. So they are on the offense. What are we doing to spread liberty into Muslim communities? We're so much heaped in apologetics that we are forgetting what we do. I was on the U.S. Commission on Religious Freedom. It was my only opportunity to ever go to Saudi Arabia. Had I not been there as a diplomat 2 years ago, I would not have been able to leave that country. We talked to the Saudis. They are functionally our allies when it comes, especially now, you'll see obviously a lot of the gyrations with the Trump administration and others as they try to reset the diplomatic calendar in the Middle East into basically now we're back to middle of the 20th century where the U.S. was with the Saudis, the Egyptians, and some of the Gulf states, while Russia was with Syria, Iran, and the Shia majority in Iraq. That's sort of the division in the Middle East. But the bottom line is that I think my identity is not only that I joined the military because I got a medical scholarship, but the bottom line is the only thing I would ever die for is the United States, and especially our Constitution. The fact that I could practice religious freedom here in the U.S. and my form, my interpretation of Islam, like no Muslims could anywhere else on the planet, that is an idea that we are squandering. We should be able to take that idea of religious freedom and operationalize it and unapologetically evangelize it, not from a religious perspective, but from a liberty perspective, evangelize classical liberty across the world. And this is not a small thing. I'm talking about who's the constituency for Islamists. The constituency for Islamists are a quarter of the world's population. A quarter. 23-24% of the world is Muslim. And right now, the numbers are about 20-30% of them are Islamists. So if you look at numbers, there's been studies recently when they looked at the revolutions across the Middle East. The tipping point for revolutions, and this actually then was retrofitted into other revolutions, when you talk about mass movements occur once you start crossing the threshold of 8, 9, 10% of the population. Once you get to 11%, then things start changing. The Egyptian government, this revolution started in January 2011. Once over 10, 15, and actually 30% of the population was no longer showing up for work, they were in the streets. You had a country of 70, 80 million in which you had 10 to 15 million in the streets. The economy stopped and the government was paralyzed. And that changed their society. The Mubarak dictatorship stopped. It ended. He was put in jail, and they had a revolution. Now, many will say, well, they ended up with something worse, which is true. They did. They ended up with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is theocracy, pure and simple. But I would tell you that, use Iran as an example. Iran now has had 40 years of Khomeinist Islamic theocracy since 1979. Before that, they had the Shah. And many of you could say, well, look, we now had much worse. We have the biggest threat to the United States on the planet is Iran, which is probably true. We're trying to make sure they don't get nuclear weapons. Why didn't we just keep the Shah? And certainly that was part of the mission of the CIA and other intelligence operations in the 50s and 60s, was to try to keep the Shah in power. That Game of Thrones way to approach the Middle East is nonsense. We need to change that. Let the people determine their own destiny, as we're trying to do in Venezuela. I don't really understand the difference in why we're approaching Venezuela different than we have Syria or any other country in the Middle East. But as you look at strategically, 40 years in Iran of theocracy, now you have another nascent revolution on the verge of happening. Their economy has an inflation of 50 to 100% over the last 6 months. That government is only still in existence because Russia has been feeding them, China has been feeding them billions in order to maintain their economy. And since the sanctions got put back in, they are on the verge of actually falling. If they fall, they will never re-elect a theocracy, and neither will they elect a monarchy. So they're maturing. And I think if you look through most revolutions, they mature. They go through a maturational process. This is the country my family came from, in Syria. Each of these countries that have had revolutions in the Middle East have gone through different evolutions. And Syria's revolution failed. The Egyptian revolution went to the election of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, how could 20-30% of the people elect in supposedly a democracy a party that ended up winning? Well, because the others divided into 10, 15 different parties. So a plurality ended up winning the election. And actually then when they had a runoff with the top two candidates, the second candidate that lost to the Brotherhood was the head of the intelligence for Mubarak that was still running the National Democratic Party of Egypt. So the bottom line is you had post-revolution, and you saw this in the Palestinian areas too. When they had their first election, they ended up electing Hamas. They went from a secular militant group, Fatah, to saying, you know what, we want to elect some religious folks so that they can run things in a religious way. And they're starting to realize now, the Palestinians, that Hamas is more evil than Fatah. But again, it's not just binary. They don't always have just two choices of either secular military dictators or theocracy. So what is the role of the United States in watching this? Do we just say, oh, you know, as Sarah Palin said, let Allah figure it out, and we'll just sort of sit back here and let them kill each other? You know, that's fine. I think militarily, I've come to not disagree with that. I do not think it's the role of the U.S. military to do any of that, other than maybe through special ops into places like Somalia to target folks that are targeting us directly. We can talk about the operation against the imam that basically had declared war on the United States. So we got him in Yemen in 2010. Now, he was an American citizen, so I know many in the libertarian community said that was an unauthorized assassination. But basically, he had driven many significant attacks against the United States, including Nidal Hassan. So Imam Awlaki was his name. But bottom line is, these are targeted operations for American security, which is very different than large deployments that I don't think we need. And have also, as we've seen in Afghanistan, have been proven to be ineffective. We've given so much blood and treasure in Afghanistan, and it is completely ineffective. Now, am I all for a complete withdrawal? No, I think we need some presence there for intelligence, but it can be very small special forces operations. The other issue is, if we leave these things alone and we just sort of say, let's wait till it comes to our borders, you're going to have, there's mass migration issues. And you've got millions pouring into Europe right now that are changing the culture already. Many of the countries in Europe have 10-15% of their population that is Muslim, so they already have assimilation problems. I have a podcast called Reform This, and last week I did the podcast about assimilation, vice or virtue. And when we talk about assimilation, it's always in some communities felt to be a negative, pejorative, and others it's felt to be sort of a right to become an American. I take a middle of the road, which is assimilation really has to do with maintaining your identity, your cultural identity, and who you are, but also beginning to believe in the social contract, which is our Constitution, in becoming an American. And we don't do that very well, I don't think, with our immigrant populations. We don't have significant programs to teach them liberty, let alone our own 10th generation Americans who are losing their understanding of what freedom and our constitutional principles are. But I do think the immigration issue, as it gets bandied about, we went in politics in America from Islam is not a problem on 9/12/01 to Islam is the problem, as we saw with the cartoon crisis in 05 and 06 and all the other things happening where you started to see a huge swing to maybe Islam has a problem and we have to deal with it. The negatives about the faith of Islam have gone from 33% on 9/12/01 to 65% right now. So I don't care what any of the Islamist organizations in America think about my work or how self-hating they think it might be. Whatever they're doing is not working. Whatever they're doing is not making Americans feel more comfortable about the faith of Islam and what exactly is our theological understanding of our faith and what exactly is the role for theopolitical movements, if any. And that's why our organization is focused on the separation of mosque and state. But I do think the discussion of liberty internally in America, what do you do with populations, sectors, communities that get ghettoized or not ghettoized, that are segregated, that have separatist ideas, that we coddle in the name of freedom, and yet we don't hold them accountable? Our organization has supported some of the movement, not entire movement, because in some states it's been done very dysfunctionally, but in other states, in Arizona and Florida and Michigan, it's been done very well. It's called the American Laws for American Courts movement. And that movement talks about the fact that regardless of what your faith is, you can't use religious freedom to endorse, for example, in Islam, the Islamic law that's majority Islamic law in America today, most imams believe when you look at a woman's vote or witness in a court, it's worth half of that of a man. When you look at her inheritance rights in trust, their family trusts, it's a quarter of that of a man. When you look at the right to divorce, a man can divorce his wife, but a woman cannot necessarily divorce her husband. These are things that many imams, there's an organization called the Assembly of Muslim Jurists of America. Go to their website, the Assembly of Muslim Jurists of America. You will find a list of 100 scholars that include most of the leading Muslim organizations in America. So these are the imams that are leading our communities, and you will see fatwas, which are religious ruling. A fatwa is an Arabic word for religious ruling, an edict, like canonic law or Talmudic law, that tells Muslims in America don't work for the Pentagon because they're leading wars against Muslims. That says don't say the Pledge of Allegiance because it is swearing to a non-Muslim country. There are edicts in there that are not only anti-American but are separatist in their mindset. Now, do they have a freedom to do that? Fine. But let's expose it. Let's talk about it. Let's have a diverse understanding of what it means to be Muslim and not hide that information. Use those same imams as the standard bearers for the Muslim community. Right now, there are 2 Muslim women that have been elected to the Congress. One is Ilhan Omar from Minnesota. The other is Rashida Tlaib from Dearborn area from Michigan. They are probably one of the most leftist, radical, socialist, anti-freedom leaders that we've had in our community, and yet they've been elected. So, fine. They want to celebrate diversity, that Muslims have been elected, that's fine. But to say and put them out as being sort of a representative of moderate mainstream Muslims is absurd. Most of the Muslim community I know are free market, independent, small business owners that would have nothing to do with Rashida Tlaib's or Ilhan Omar's socialism. And yet they get pushed as being representatives of the Muslim community. Why? Because of the pathology of identity politic, the concept that if you're against certain types of immigration that you're for a Muslim ban, when in fact yes, there's no doubt that political leadership has been very dysfunctional in some of the terms they used. I wish they had talked about an Islamist ban versus a Muslim ban, but we can talk about some of that semantics. This is what I call the Islamic Mafia around the planet, and those are the leaders of the 56 countries that are Muslim majority. That emblem on the top is the emblem of the OIC, is the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. So if you ever go home and you scratch your head and you say, why is it the United Nations spends over half of its votes dealing with a little country like Israel? It's because of these countries. You have a democracy which is one of the most innovative democracies on the planet, Israel, and yet Ilhan Omar was interviewed 3 days ago. She couldn't get herself to even recognize the state, and yet when she talked about it, compared it to Iran and Saudi Arabia as a theocracy, showing not only the rampant ignorance of these new members of Congress, but the bottom line, how much anti-Semitism there is in the leadership in our community. And it's coming from the fact that these countries have been funding these organizations for the last 50 years. So the money's put behind Georgetown Center for Muslim Christian Understanding by bin Talal from Saudi Arabia, where they've had endowments of tens of millions of dollars, has been put there because the return on the investment there is to create future Muslim leaders that are anti-Israel, that are anti-Western, might be able to talk the talk, but the bottom line is they do not really push any pressure back upon these countries in the Middle East and the ideas that they've been suppressing. So the second thing I wanted to make sure you're left with is when you talk about diversity, too often diversity in the Muslim community is somehow, well, okay, we have an Egyptian Muslim, a Pakistani Muslim, a Syrian one, that ethnic diversity is diversity. That's a form of diversity, but how often do you see diverse ideas in the Muslim community? I don't mind there's socialists in our community, but we should also hear from free market Muslims, from conservative liberals, gay rights activists, feminists, and others. So this is things that we're just not hearing. 99% of the standard bearers for Muslim community are put there because they wear a hijab. One of the classic metaphors, I think, of the problem with our representation, again disagreeing with Ernie's initial comments, the classic problems is if you look at the Olympics 2 years ago, everybody knew that the fencer was Muslim because she wore a hijab, and she was put out as sort of, oh, look at, she even was almost going to be the torch bearer for the team, even though she was really not the top of her sport, but almost put there instead of Michael Phelps to carry the torch out in the opening ceremonies because of the identity politic. And how many of you knew that the gold medal winner for track for 400 meters was a Muslim woman? She won a gold and a silver, but she didn't wear the traditional headdress, didn't look Muslim. She looked like a normal African-American track star, and she wouldn't really fit the bill to be used on a poster as an American Muslim that would qualify for the identity politics. So this is the problem. And these organizations across the country that have been started in the 60s and 70s as offshoots of the Muslim Student Association, I call part of the Muslim Brotherhood legacy groups, are the primary problem. And it includes organizations that are fixated on pushing forth the idea to media that that America is anti-Muslim, that you're controlled by conspiracy theory X, Y, and Z, and that the bottom line is that we are victims as Muslims. So, again, my testimony to Congress against them has not been to take away their rights, but to put them in the right place of what they actually represent, which is the theopolitical movement in the West of the Islamist ideology. So where is Islam in its arc of history? I think this is really the third thing I wanted to make sure you understood is we talk about Islam, and I'm sure many of you have Muslim friends. When you talk to them, it's almost as if you have an ahistorical approach to Islam and Muslims. President Bush had an ahistorical approach when he put mission accomplished across the carrier as we defeated Saddam Hussein, and said that somehow Iraq would then all of a sudden become a Jeffersonian democracy. And that was absurd. But yet I was in favor of destroying Saddam Hussein, because I can tell you, as family that has been victimized and tortured by these dictators, Syria has proven they cannot get rid of these dictators on their own. Now, again, I don't think we should be sending our troops to do that, but there are ways for us to at least take sides in those wars. Because when we don't take a side in an internal conflict, the other side, if it was just domestic, I'm with you. But in Syria, Assad would not be there today had it not been for Russia and Iran. He was propped up. His monies were handed to him continuously. His economy was paralyzed. There was nobody in the country really working for a few years. It was completely destroyed economy. And yet he survived because Putin and Khamenei and even some monies from China provided his continued support. So for us to stay out of that when you have a country on the border of Israel and so many other reasons, I think, is proving we're going to end up not doing things with a small investment that would end up requiring a much larger investment later. I do believe if you look at the 30 Years' War, 8 million people died in 30 years in the religious conflicts in Europe. So if you look back at that, that was in the 16th century. Islam is 1438 years old. Islam right now is going through, I believe, this process. Most religions start going through a process in which they begin to push back against the establishment. And that's why I think the greatest democracy on the planet was founded by folks who were faithful to their whatever faith, however they described and felt their Christianity to be, but they rejected the establishment of religion. And I think Islam is going through that same process. Now, what are some of the major shifts that are happening? You cannot have an ahistorical approach to Islam. And what do I mean by that? So Islam is 1438 years old. We believe it was founded by the Prophet Muhammad with a message from the angel Gabriel in which the scripture was revealed to him over 23 years. Call that mythology, call it what you want, but at the end of the day, when the Prophet Muhammad died, there were the first 4 caliphs, 3 of them were assassinated. So I would tell you, as somebody who loves my faith, that Islam's fundamentals, whatever those may be, started to vanish immediately after the death of the Prophet, and it became chaotic. Now, the first 700 years of Islamic history were dynasties. There was no democracies, there was no secular countries and free thinking. So then it was followed in 1500 or so by the Ottomans. And the Ottomans were a militarized society that ran the Islamic world for 400 years until they fell apart in the 20th century. So 1,300 of the last 1,400 years have been dynasties or the Ottomans. And yet the first 7 centuries of dynasties were really the golden age of the planet at the time. So when we hold Islam and Muslims accountable to American 20th century ideas, is that really an appropriate historical approach? And I think as people who are educated and intellectuals, you would want to hold the people accountable to where they are in their historical arc. Then you have, after the Ottomans, you had a colonial era in between there, actually, same period, that brought some of the ideas. I mean, the largest democracy on the planet is where? Is India. India has almost 1 billion people. That's a democracy because I believe of the British influence on India. Now, you will see that the country with the largest Muslim population on the planet, some people say is Indonesia, but that's Muslim majority. It's India. India has almost 400 million Muslims. They're a minority, but yet they're a vibrant democracy with their problems. But I think one of the most pathological countries on the planet is Pakistan, which should have never been created. It was created on the whim that you should have an Islamic republic. And that concept is what we're working against. As long as you tie national patriotic identity to Islam and to a single faith, you can never bring liberty to those countries. And we'll talk about that. So nationalism, or city and state, was sort of what was left behind as we carved out in the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and a lot of the countries across the Middle East are really early 20th century creations. So when we talk about them being chaotic and falling apart, these are not old countries. They've barely been around, some of them, for 60, 70 years. So if Syria falls apart, I was much against that for reasons we can talk about, but if you need a Kurdistan, why not allow it to be formed? These are not old historic countries that have established identity. They were carved out by colonial powers that probably now may need to be reset a bit. So bottom line, though, is that national identity, I believe, is where the struggle is. Because if the Islamists win out, they want to create Islamic identities with their countries and then create that. Remember I showed you the picture of all those rulers of the Muslim countries. Left to their own devices, each of them hate each other. In that picture, I showed you Khomeini standing right next to the king of Saudi Arabia, taking a picture as part of the Islamic cooperation. They hate each other. They're on the verge of war half the time. And yet they come together because they want to collectivize against, they divide theologically the planet into the land of Islam, Dar al-Islam in Arabic, and the land of war is everything else, Dar al-Harb. That's their theology, is that if it's not Muslim majority run with Islamic law, it must be the land of war, no matter what it is. That is their theology. So unless Americans and libertarians get into the business of starting to work with Muslims that reject that theology, at some point they're going to be knocking at our door. And the bottom line is, the post-colonial vacuums, we pull out of there. They took some of our ideas. When I was on the U.S. Commission on Religious Freedom, the Indian government refused to let us come in. Refused. Even though they have a lot of religious freedom issues we wanted to talk to them about with the Sikh community, with the Muslim community, with Hindu community regarding religious freedom. But because of their colonial history, they have a huge aversion to foreign entities coming into their country and telling them how to run their business. And it's pathological because there's some significant religious freedom issues inside India, and yet they did not want us coming in to do that. So a lot of what we're seeing today with revolutions is related to 20th century dictatorships that are very dysfunctional, that ultimately will not sort of spontaneously disappear and then be replaced by liberal democracies and reformists. There are many reformers doing the work that I'm doing inside the prisons of Saudi Arabia, doing inside the prisons of Iran and Egypt and elsewhere. Yes, as al-Sisi is a bit better than the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, but he's continuing to torture journalists and freedom activists, and the media there cannot be used as a tool to reform the center. The Vatican of Sunni Islam right now is in Cairo, Al-Azhar, basically. They compete with the Saudis for that title, but the bottom line is Al-Azhar University does a lot of that work. But to say that they have vibrant debates about Islamic law is absurd. So these are the things that I think need reform. Ijtihad in Arabic means a modern interpretation of religion in light of modern day, or reform. It's been replaced with fundamentalist nihilism. That's really how the ISIS jihadists get into the hearts of young kids. It's called jihadi cool, if you will. They have videos and social media and other things in which they get these kids that are really nominally understand their faith, but yet they get them into this gang community mentality. It's a fundamentalist nihilism, if you will. The Arab awakening, I think, was a huge opportunity. Again, through the example and the metaphor of what President Trump brought to the table in America, chaos and disruption, I believe, is a good thing. Sometimes the elite and the intellectuals get so dominant and self-righteous and self-absorbed in what they're doing inside the Beltway or inside whatever community, they need to be completely disorganized and disrupted in order for you to have real reform. And this is the problem, I think, with what we saw in the Arab awakening. Every time, one of the most common questions I get is, well, Zuhdi, what do you want us to do? ISIS will be worse than Assad, so let's support Assad. That's what Senator Rand Paul says all the time. First of all, that there's bigotry enlaced in that comment, which is somehow let's support some ruthless genocidal dictator who uses chemical weapons because the the group that comes next will be worse. Second, they can evolve. There is evolution. As long as they don't have nuclear weapons and don't threaten their external countries and us, let them evolve, but we can't support a tyrant because we're worried about what will come next. It almost appears as if then we're not only doing a Game of Thrones, but as if we're God to know what's coming next. And I think Iran shows that eventually they will evolve away from that. The debate needs to move from exegesis. Right now, if you talk, I did a debate here at Scottsdale against one of the imams a few years ago. It's amazing, the mindset when you debate Muslim leaders, even in America that have been here for many generations. They really think of law and society as an exegetical exercise. What does the scripture say about X, Y, and Z? It's a very black and white approach to religion versus reason. So many people say, well, Zuhdi, you don't have a degree in Sharia. Many of the people you work with are not Sharia experts. So therefore, you really are, it's a waste of time. You need to get imams on your side. I think most of you know, as you know, the founding fathers were not priests. And yet they developed the foundations of the greatest country on the planet. So I don't think we need to put our investment in the priests or the imams of Islam. They're going to come later, when the liberals, the classical liberals, start funding religious institutions and building them and hiring the imams to come up with a way to change the Islamic law so that it fits liberal society. They're not going to do it first because they're not courageous enough, and because some of the institutional, the problem is 99% of the imams I know have not read Hayek, have not read the libertarian thinkers from Rousseau and all of the philosophers and others that form what Western thought and ideas are. Is the Quran, is religion a source or the source of law? That little nuance is a huge issue that I think if we focused on could reform the entire Middle East and Muslim world. Majoritocracy versus minority rights. This is the issue I think with populism. I'm very much in favor of populism. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of that, but not completely, because populism left to its nth degree then becomes a suppression of minority rights and minority identifications. So this is the problem with populism. But on the other hand, if you look at the Arab awakening, it proved that majoritocracy, while it pushed back against dictators, then when it got implemented democratically, destroyed the 49% of the population that did not vote for the folks that got into power. These are the countries and the dates that they became what they are. I think it's obvious that they're pretty new, but what I always tell, forget the religious part, look at what products have come from any of these countries. Free market products that have originated, cars, technology, computer, whatever it might be. The only thing coming out of there is the oil. My grandfather, who was in jail for a few years in Syria before my family escaped, and basically said until the oil runs out, as long as they're using resources under the earth, they will never use the resources between their ears. And you know, that's the problem. So as I mentioned before, jihadists want to die for their team. And if you look at the metaphor right now, I think any sport metaphor works, which is you've got some jihadists on the field that want to fight and kill themselves and die for their cause. You've got some cheering them on, which are part of the movements that I talked about, where they might not like some of the methods, the violence, but yet they like the game. They support it. And then you've got the jihadists at home who might watch the game here and there or not even watch it at all, but yet they're completely asleep, and yet their team is Team Jihad. They think that ultimately that's their supporting identity. We have to step away from a binary approach to the Middle East, a binary approach to Islam where it's either theocracy or secular dictatorship. There needs to be a third pathway, which I call the liberty, our liberty project or liberty doctrine. These words right here, I think the nuclear weapon regarding liberty is creating governments that have an establishment clause that prevents the establishment. The word ummah in Arabic means faith community. I've actually talked to Arabic communities about de-ummatizing Islam. Well, what does that mean? Well, Islam, ummah not only means faith community, it means state. So until Muslims can separate the concept of state from the concept of faith community or de-ummatizing it, that'll never happen. And most of the Muslims, there's one Islamic university in America, Zaytuna University in San Francisco. That guy was talking to President Bush a month after the 9/11 as being a representative, a moderate, and he comes across as a slick, sort of well-greased American Muslim. And yet he says that his goal is to make the West an Islamic state. Now, he'll give you qualifications that it's basically in the same Judeo-Christian principles, but yet you'll find that he's for an Islamic ummah. And Islamic statecraft, we have to talk about Sharia. When I was testifying to Congress, Jackie Speier, one of the congresswomen from California, was interrogating me and said, what's your qualifications? What gives you a right to come and talk about Islamic law to our Congress? And I said, you know, ma'am, you're sitting in halls of a Congress that was created by folks that rejected Christian theocracy. So you should be the last person telling me that. And yet she said, I would never want to speak about the Catholic. She said, I'm Catholic. I would never speak against, you know, as somebody who's an expert on Catholic law when we're talking about their pedophilia problem. Made no sense. Blasphemy issues, apostasy. So apostasy are laws that prevent people from leaving the faith of Islam, and if they do, they get killed. I want you to pair that up with treason, because if the state and Islam are one, apostasy, they match to treason. So when the Saudis talk to us about Islamic law, they say, well, you have laws in America about treason. If somebody's serving your military and they leave, that's treasonous, or they've abandoned their military. So this is actually where us reformers will say, you know, you look, the Prophet Muhammad did have a military, and they fought wars. So yes, if you were in the Prophet's army and you decided to leave and they had declared war on the pagans, that is abandonment. That is basically desertion. And even our American military has laws that include capital punishment for desertion. Now, fast forward to the 21st century, if we're going to reform these ideas, we need to do it, I think, through Muslims saying that the era of jihad is over. The era of any military having an identity of fighting a jihad. So Turkey is a member of NATO. A member of NATO now, we have a country that Erdogan's aspirations are not only to bring back sort of a caliphate, but if his military were to fight a war in Syria, I guarantee you that the verbiage they use on Turkish television is they are fighting a jihad. We should not be allied, let alone have them in NATO, with countries that are fighting jihads. It doesn't make any sense. Same with the Saudi military. We have basically blinders that are quite problematic. This is on our homepage on our website, that there are elements within the faith of Islam that Muslims can look to self-criticism, to self-repair, that it can be done from a position of tough love, and that this is a mission that we use to advocate for the preservation of the founding principles of the U.S. Constitution, liberty and freedom, through the separation of mosque and state. Again, we recognize that we're not like the organizations in the U.S., Citizens United for the Separation of Church and State. That's a far-left, anti-religious movement. We don't want freedom from religion. We just want freedom of religion. And I think that's and that's why if you have an ahistorical approach to Islam, you would understand that Islam right now is where the West was in the 17th, 18th century. It is not where the discussion of religious freedom is in America in the 21st century. It's a whole different issue. I hope you understand Islamism now, which is political Islam related to viral movements and related to top-down movements. So whether it's the royal family, sort of like the corporate Islamists in Saudi Arabia that have a board of directors, which is their family that decides to implement Sharia law, or whether it's these masses that are viral. This is the Sunni masses of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Shia masses of the Khomeinis. It's the same Kool-Aid that they're drinking, which is political Islam, institution of theocracy. The ideology is quite similar. It's all about identity. Will our immigrants, will our Muslim population begin to identify not only as a minority, where we're barely 1% of the population here, but I think we have an opportunity here in America to operationalize liberty, to operationalize religious freedom, and bring it forth in a way that you can't do anywhere else. So last, I've got two diagrams I want to share with you, and then I'll take your questions. One is, if you look at the world, as I mentioned to you, 70% of the world right now lives under some type of tyranny, and so where are the minority religious beliefs persecuted and oppressed, and where are they free and defended? Obviously in the West and America, and the rest includes a triangle, which is Russia, China, and the Muslim majority countries. You take those three and you got 80-90% of the planet, and those are tyrannies versus America and the West. Now you lay over that the Muslim population, which is a quarter of the world's population, and there's this little intersection that I think is the future, as the title of my talk was, what is the future or the hope of freedom in the Muslim world? It's these Muslims here. These Muslims in the countries in the Middle East that are all tyrannies, they're trying to repair their condition, but they're still being tortured. They don't have the mechanism. They start an organization like ours and it lasts 3 months and then they're in prison or shot or dead. So eventually with revolutions this will change, but to build lasting texts and ideas that can become part of legacy work can only be done in the West. The civil rights movement of today is inside the American mosques. So if you don't take sides and if you think it's going to repair itself, look up some of my own conflicts here with some of the mosques locally, and you'll see that the civil rights movement, I believe, will happen when Muslims start no longer saying, well, we live in America, let these radicals run the mosques. No, until we feel we have to run our own mosques or start some new ones that are more freedom-based, you're going to continue to have problems. The most common question I get is, well, how many Muslims agree with you? And are you a mutation of the Muslim community? So if you do a continuum of the Muslim population across the planet, from very secular, and I don't like that term because it implies non-practicing, but whichever way you want to, I would say just oppose it from theocracy. Most of the data shows that 30 to 40% of the Muslim world left to their own devices believes that Islam should be part of the national identity and the legal system. 60 to 70% are secular. So you overlay that with extremists, violent extremists that believe that the ends justify the means and we use terrorism. You've got the Assad, Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi militants, Fatah, those who use terror to get control. Same thing here, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Jamaat Islamiyya, all the radical Islamist groups. And you're left with 80% in the middle that are non-violent majority of Muslims. So, worldview is the key. What are the worldview of Muslims that you talk to? What is the lens that they look at the world through? The ends justifies the means on each end, or is it liberalism versus Islamism? And that's really right here, until we start to work here, and correct me please if I'm wrong, if any of you know that we're doing work right here in this continuum between theocracy and secularism among Muslim populations, please let me know. There are many leaders doing that work. I can tell you droves of books. We've got a bibliography on our website of folks that are doing that work like we are, but it's really far behind. That's my book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam. It's my story and a lot of what I've talked to you about here today. This is our Muslim reform movement, as Dr. Fisher mentioned. There were 24 of us that got together in Washington and laid out a Muslim reform movement declaration that includes our principles. We said if Muslims sign on to that document, 2 pages, simple document, equality of men and women, the individual rights of folks to be able to express themselves, leave Islam, criticize Islam, the fact that Islam is an idea, it has no rights, so we reject the term Islamophobia. There are many ideas in there that are part of our declaration. I brought some copies. If they sign on to that, then I think they're part of the future. We posted it in a Martin Luther-esque type of way on some of the mosques, the Saudi-funded ones in Washington, and we'll continue to do so where we can. Here's the last contact point for you. I've got some, our website, Take Back Islam, our website, aifdemocracy.org. My podcast at Blaze Radio is Reform This, and here's our contact points. So, thank you. Any questions? Yes, Mark.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, we'll just take, I'm sorry. Absolutely. So to take your first question, I think, the bottom line is fundamentalists believe that you can't take inventions, new things, and put them into religion. And I've done a number of podcasts on, the question is not, was the Prophet Muhammad an Islamist? Was he a jihadist? Absolutely he was. But the question is not what he did in the 7th century. The question is, what would the Prophet Muhammad do if he were alive today? And I think if the Prophet Muhammad were alive today, he would say, you know what, wow, this American experiment is fantastic. It's a much better technology. So I would tell the Muslims that say jihad says X in the Quran, I would tell them, okay, if you use modern computer science, medical science, why can't you use modern political science? Why can't the concept of jihad become archaic? The Quran says you can marry 4 women. There's no doubt that that's in black and white. And yet I've never met a Muslim married to more than one wife. So why is that? Are they rejecting their scripture? No, we say, you know what, we're not going to rip it out. I'm not for, and a lot of religions have this debate about what does reform mean. I would say you relegate some things in the Quran to history, and some things apply to today. I'm not going to rip it out. It's a good historical document on some things, but there are things that just don't apply anymore to today. So jihad does not apply anymore. It's not necessary. When Islam was on the verge of complete extinction, it made sense to have a military that was Muslim fighting against the pagans. Today they're a quarter of the world's population. It's not going to ever be extinguished. They don't need jihad anymore. The technology of a modern secular state makes a lot more sense from a religious freedom perspective. Your other question, I would push back to you and say you believe in a non-aggression principle for libertarianism. So the problem with right now, the secular movements, the anti-religious secular movements in America and in the West, one of the reasons Islamists are spreading so much in Europe is because of how vicious the anti-Christian and anti-Jewish mentality is in many of the communities there, where there's no ability to publicly wear a yarmulke, a hijab, or cross. It becomes so toxic to having religion around you. For example, celebrating Ramadan, fasting publicly, celebrating Hanukkah or Christmas. That's what I mean by freedom from religion. You should be proud of the folks in your community to be able to be publicly proud of their faith. When you prohibit and you make the culture toxic to where they're no longer proud of publicly displaying their faith, that is what I'm afraid of. Not legal imposition, forcing them. Yes, people can be secular and be proud of it. They should never be forced into religious practice. Yeah. Right. Yes, sir. Actually, not really. Now, Salman Rushdie, a lot of the artists, and I defend them, I think the speech at extremes is the ones we need to defend. The cartoonists, because you don't define the character of a culture by the moderates. You define it by which extremists it will defend in the speech I'm talking about. So Salman Rushdie left, I don't even know if he was Muslim, but I know he left the faith if he was. So I would tell you that we work closely, for example, with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who's done great work at her foundation on female genital mutilation. She was from Somalia, went to the Netherlands, was attacked in the Netherlands, and then came to the U.S. But she left Islam. So a lot of the people who attack Islam from outside will always engender a lot more, I think, hate and other things because it appears like it's somebody external who hates the faith versus somebody internal who loves the faith but wants to modernize it into something that's in terms with the 21st century, not the 13th century. But I think at the end of the day, the Asiya Bibis of the world, there was another lady who left Saudi Arabia that was brought to Canada 2 days ago that left Islam and locked herself in a room in an airport in Thailand because if she went back to Saudi Arabia, she would be tortured and killed. Now, she left Islam. Our ability to protect her is very important. And I think sometimes we forget the importance of the folks. When I was on the U.S. Commission on Religious Freedom, I reminded them that some of our best allies are folks within the majorities of these countries that are reformists, that are political ideologues that push back against the theocrats, and I think that's the role that I would play. I'm actually not we get a lot of threats verbally, etc., but not as many physical threats, because it's a lot more dangerous for them to kill somebody like me from within the community than it is for somebody outside that they see it as an external threat against their gang, their tribe. Dr. Fisher. That's a great question. So, you know, our traction, he said, how much traction has our reform movement gathered since we formed in December 2015? Leadership-wise, we've got about 25 to 30 leaders. We've got followers on social media, about 500,000 followers between. Now, how many of those are Muslim? I think the most important part is what's the Muslim traction. We work with Quilliam Foundation in London that includes Majid Nawaz, Osama Hassan. We work with Rahil Raza in Toronto, Tariq Fatah. We work with Ezra Nomani, who many of these folks actually you may have seen on the Bill Maher show and some of the other mainstream media areas. You know, it's hard. I think we've made slow progress. I think if we had more platforms and were given more legitimacy, actually we're part of the mainstream, we would have had a lot more progress. I mean, this Muslim congresswoman from Minnesota, who's a radical Islamist, has 500,000 followers on Twitter in just 3 months. And yet that's been our progress on Twitter and social media now in the last 15 years. So her friend's from Dearborn, but she's from Keith Ellison's district, just around Minneapolis. No, actually the percent Muslim population in her district is about 5-6%. Yeah, it's very small. So we're trying to get traction. If you're waiting for masses of Muslims to show up in the streets, I'm going to hang it up. This is a waste of time. If you're waiting for leaders, our Muslim Liberty Project is about creating future leaders that can begin to do what I'm doing. And that's really where we're investing, is creating Muslims that can shake the boat and disruption. One last question, sorry. Oh, okay. Okay, go ahead. Yes. Yeah. I appreciate your question. I strongly disagree. I think if you look at the Christian community in that during the 30 Years' War, before Enlightenment and during the Enlightenment process, during the Reformation and during the process that created what led to the French and American and Western revolutions, there were many, many well-to-do Christians that believed in theocracy. So you're talking about a standard that includes your friends that would not want to ever hurt somebody or are non-violent, and that's why I said that's the middle part. Certainly, I've met maybe one at most Muslim that believes that terrorism is a means to achieve what they want to do, but most of them still have not gone through that need to reform against theocracy. They still view their faith as a theocratic mandate. Now, they may say, well, you know what, that's the faith, but we're not, I'd rather be in America. And I think that's the issue, is that they're not sort of operationalizing how to begin to, and so many of the Muslims I talk to, they say, yeah, I want my kids to be Muslim, but not that kind of Islam. Well, what books would you like them to read? You go to the mosque, The mosque's Sharia text says, kill those who leave Islam. Says, if you look in the fine little footnotes, not on the front page, you're right, the Quran looks mostly like the Bible on a lot of things, but the interpretations, the tafsir, is still 13th century tafsir that's in there. So they're not doing the hard intellectual work. There's been no movements, the Jabotinskis that were involved in the reform of Judaism, that involved how it assimilated, etc., into the West. That is not happening yet in mass movements in Islam. Most of the Muslims you're talking to are just sort of detached and have reformed it in their head, but there's no intellectual substance to back that up. The establishment is still pretty radical and pretty anti-American. And I define radical as theocratic, not necessarily violent. Last question. Yes, sir. Yeah, that's actually, if you look at Al Jazeera, if you look at The Intercept, a Russian-funded or allied or organization, media, that's a lot of the common Islamist responses. Well, Jasser is a hypocrite because he supports Israel, which is a Jewish state, and he doesn't support an Islamic state. I would tell you, first of all, there are barely, 18 million Jews on the planet. So this is not, their caliphate, if you would not be a threat. Number two, Israel is not a theocratic state. It is a secular state with vibrant populations of other faiths. Third, the foundations of the building of Israel are related to a time in which they lost almost a quarter, if not more, of their world's population in a Holocaust. So they needed a place in which they were not going to become victims of another genocide. So I think that the premise of the need of the intellectual, moral, ethical foundations of the need for the state of Israel, not to mention, even theologically, I could give you justification in the Quran for the existence of the state of Israel, which is the only state in the Quran that's recognized by God as being a state, is Israel. So I could give you theological reasons, I could give you intellectual reasons, but it is there's no moral equivalency between a quarter of the world's population deciding to set up Islamic states versus Israel, which is barely, 6-7 million people or whatever the population is there. So I know did I answer your question or? Okay. Okay. Thank you.